Elena
The
Hart had never
projections
once
show a
considered
critical
the
flaw.
possibility that she
What?
could be
How?
so
The
profoundly,
partnership is at
irreversibly
risk.
wrong. She had built
Would you
her
like a
entire
brownie?
existence on the
Oh,
conviction
thank
that
you.
the
It looks
world
great.
operated
Thank you
according
so
to a
much.
simple and
Delicious.
elegant hierarchy. One where success was visible, where achievement was legible, and where a person's
So,
worth
for the
could be
global growth
measured by the
strategy?
company they
Yes,
kept,
the projections look
the
very
address
strong.
on their business
Good.
card,
Let's review the
and the
details.
number of
These
zeros
books
trailing
are
their net
wonderful.
worth.
I agree. The kids
It was
will
not a
love them.
cruel philosophy,
Let's pick some for story
she
time.
told
Good
herself.
idea.
It was simply a realistic one. The world rewarded those who climbed, who hustled, who refused to settle. And Elena Hart had climbed higher and faster than almost anyone she had ever known. At 34 years old, she sat at the top of Hart Innovations, a technology conglomerate she had built from a single seed funding round into an empire valued at several $100 million. Her name appeared regularly on the covers of business magazines. Her keynote addresses drew standing ovations. Her every professional move was analyzed and discussed in boardrooms and business school curricula across the country. And yet, none of it, not the awards, not the accolades, not the perfectly engineered life she had assembled, had prepared her for the morning. She walked into a conference room and felt the floor quietly dissolve beneath her feet. She had arrived in the world with nothing that resembled an advantage. Born to parents who cycled through layoffs and evictions with a kind of weary, defeated regularity, Elena had grown up in apartments where the heat was sometimes a luxury, and birthday dinners were sometimes negotiated away in favor of overdue rent. She had watched her father crumple under the weight of financial failure, a man who had once laughed easily and loved generously, reduced by debt and shame into something quieter and more brittle with each passing year. She had watched her mother hold the family together with a pride so fierce it bordered on grief, and she had made herself a promise so deep it had calcified into identity. She would never, under any circumstances, inhabit that kind of smallness again. She would build something unassailable. She would become someone no one could dismiss. The vow was not made with anger, exactly, but with the kind of cold and purposeful clarity that only comes from having stood at the edge of something terrifying and decided, with every cell in your body, to run in the opposite direction. She ran, and she did not stop running for the better part of 2 decades. By the time she was 30, she had already closed her first major acquisition. By 32, Hart Innovations was fielding partnership inquiries from companies she had once studied as case studies in graduate school. She surrounded herself with other high achievers, investors, executives, strategists, people who spoke in terms of leverage and scalability and quarterly projections. She found their company energizing in the way that altitude is energizing. Thin, bracing, clarifying. She evaluated potential partners, professional and personal alike, through the same unflinching lens. What have you built? What do you represent? Are you moving forward or standing still? It was not, she told herself, snobbery. It was standards. There was a difference, even if the line between them was sometimes difficult to locate from the outside. The men she dated, briefly and without much emotional expenditure, tended to be capable and presentable and ultimately interchangeable men whose ambition she respected without finding particularly interesting, men who appreciated her accomplishments in the abstract while being subtly unsettled by their specificity. None of these relationships lasted long enough to require renegotiation. Elena treated their endings with the same efficient composure she brought to the conclusion of a contract that had served its purpose. She was 34, and she was, by the metrics she had spent her life constructing, a resounding success. Her longtime personal assistant, a quietly dignified man named Gerald, who had been with the company since the early days, occasionally offered observations that Elena received with tolerant amusement. He was perceptive, in the way of people who have watched a great deal without being asked to speak. One afternoon, after a particularly charged staff meeting in which Elena had curtly dismissed a junior executive's proposal without much ceremony, Gerald paused at her office door on his way out and said, "Without particular emphasis, not everyone who wears a fine suit deserves your respect, Miss Hart. And not everyone who doesn't is beneath it." Elena had smiled at him the way one smiles at a fortune cookie, briefly, politely, and without intending to think about it again, she thought about it again, though not until much later, and not without considerable pain. The community fundraiser was not the kind of event Elena typically attended. It was organized by a local nonprofit working on educational access for underprivileged children, and her presence had been requested gently but persistently by a board member who happened to be one of her larger institutional shareholders. Elena had agreed. In the way one agrees to a minor inconvenience, when the cost of declining outweighs the cost of attending. She wore a simple dark blazer and understated earrings, her concession to the informal setting. The venue was a community center in a neighborhood she rarely passed through, its parking lot freshly painted, its interior decorated with children's artwork taped to the walls in cheerful, slightly crooked rows. Elena noted the art, the folding tables covered with donated casseroles and store-bought cakes, the volunteers moving with the particular energy of people who believe in what they are doing. She was courteous. She shook hands. She wrote a check. She prepared, in the back of her mind, to leave within the hour. That was when she noticed Brian Evans for the first time. He was standing near one of the serving tables, a man in his late 30s with dark eyes and an easy, unhurried way of moving, wearing a plain gray Henley and khakis that had clearly been washed many more times than they had been ironed. He was arranging trays of food with the focused, uncomplicated attention of someone who considers the task in front of them worthy of their full effort, regardless of its scale. Beside him, occasionally tugging at his sleeve or pointing at something across the room, was a small girl with curly dark hair and enormous eyes, dressed in a yellow sweater that was slightly too big for her. A girl who could not have been older than 8, and who radiated the particular luminous energy of a child who has been genuinely loved. Brian listened to whatever the girl was saying, crouched down to her eye level, responded, and then both of them laughed at something Elena was too far away to hear. It was an ordinary exchange, the kind that happened between parents and children thousands of times each day. And yet, Elena found herself watching it longer than she intended. She told herself it was simple observation. The man was pleasant-looking. The child was engaging. There was nothing more to it than that. When Brian eventually made his way across the room and introduced himself directly, without flourish, with a handshake that was firm and brief, Elena's assessment was instantaneous and almost entirely subconscious. He was charming in a low-key way. He was clearly not someone who moved in her professional circles. The Henley. The easy, unguarded manner. The absence of any of the particular social signals she had learned to recognize in rooms where power congregated. He was, she concluded with the rapid decisiveness of a woman who had made 1,000 quick reads of a room, simply not someone who belonged in her world. And yet, the conversation they fell into was not what she expected. He was funny without trying too hard. He was curious without being intrusive. He asked her what she cared about, not what she did, a distinction so unusual that it caught her briefly off guard. And his daughter Lily materialized at his side at some point and looked up at Elena with wide, thoughtful eyes and said, entirely without preamble, "Your earrings look like little planets." Elena, who was rarely disarmed, felt something in her chest shift almost imperceptibly. "They kind of do," she said. "I never thought of that." Lily nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her father's side. Elena stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, then collected herself. She was not, she reminded herself, in the market for ordinary. When Brian asked, near the end of the evening, if she might like to get coffee sometime casual, unhurried, with no trace of the practiced charm she associated with men who pursued her professionally or personally, Elena's refusal came quickly and without much deliberation. There were other people nearby, a cluster of volunteers, a couple of board members, the woman who had invited Elena in the first place. Elena was not aware, in the moment, of how clearly her words carried. She was focused on the efficient delivery of a boundary she considered both appropriate and obvious. "I think we probably exist in pretty different worlds," she said. Her voice was not unkind. Exactly. It was precise, conclusive, the verbal equivalent of a door being shut with quiet firmness rather than slammed. She saw something move across Brian's face. A brief, subtle reorganization of his features, there and gone so quickly that someone less observant might have missed it entirely. He did not flinch. He did not push back. He simply looked at her for one steady moment and said, "You might be right about that," with a calm so complete it was almost unnerving. And then Lily, who had been standing just behind him holding a paper plate with 2 cookies on it, reached up with her free hand and found her father's, and Brian looked down at her, and the two of them exchanged a glance that had the wordless fluency of people who have navigated hard things together. Elena turned away. She heard a muffled laugh from somewhere nearby. She chose not to look back. She did not think about it again. Or, she told herself she didn't. The weeks that followed were identical in their structure to the weeks that had preceded them. Early mornings, long meetings, quarterly reviews, dinners with investors in restaurants where the wine list was longer than some legal briefs. There was a partnership negotiation with a firm in Boston that required 3 separate trips in as many weeks. There was a media profile for a financial publication that required 4 hours of photography and an interview conducted by a journalist who was visibly more interested in Elena's shoes than in her revenue model. She moved through all of it with the efficiency she had spent her career perfecting, ticking items off mental lists with the methodical satisfaction of a person who has turned productivity into a form of comfort. And yet, in the margins of these days, during the car rides, during the slow minutes before sleep, during the particular silence between one agenda item and the next, Brian Evans appeared in her thoughts with an unprompted frequency that was, to say the least, inconvenient. It was not that she found herself romanticizing him. It was something more specific and more difficult to categorize. She kept returning to his steadiness, the quality in him that had registered, even in the 30 minutes she had known him, as something notably different from the men she typically encountered. Men in her professional orbit were often impressive and often exhausting in their impressiveness, always performing, always angling, always aware of how they were landing in the room. Brian had not seemed to be performing anything. He had simply been present in a way that felt, in retrospect, almost radical. And the way he had absorbed her rejection without collapse, without retaliation, with that particular quiet dignity, lingered in a way she couldn't quite account for. She pushed the thoughts aside as efficiently as she pushed aside anything that didn't fit neatly into her current framework. She had things to build. She did not have time for complications that arrived in gray Henleys. Meanwhile, in a part of the city she did not frequent, Brian Evans was doing what he had been doing for the past 3 years, living a life shaped entirely around what mattered. Lily's school schedule was his anchor. Her homework, her weekend activities, her small dramas and large enthusiasms, these were the coordinates of his days, and he navigated them with the devoted attention of a man who understood, with bone-deep certainty, exactly what was worth his time. He volunteered at the same community center where he and Elena had briefly collided, sorting donations on Tuesday afternoons, mentoring a small group of high school kids on Wednesday evenings. He cooked dinner. He read bedtime stories. He was, by every external measure, an utterly unremarkable man living a quiet and purposeful life, and he preferred it that way, with a preference that had been earned through a grief so profound it had fundamentally reordered his priorities. The world, largely, did not know his name. He had arranged for that deliberately. There was a version of Brian Evans that the financial press had briefly been fascinated by, in the years before he deliberately and thoroughly withdrew from their interest. That version had been photographed at conferences, had given 1 or 2 interviews that were intelligent and quotable, had been named in the kinds of lists that publications compile at the end of each year to signify that someone matters. He had been, in those years, ascending in the way that the technology world rewards and celebrates visibly, loudly, with the kind of momentum that generates its own gravity and pulls more momentum in behind it. He had not been unhappy in that life. He had been genuinely engaged by the work, genuinely energized by the people he was building things with, genuinely excited by the shape of the future he could see from where he was standing. He had also been, in ways he did not fully understand until Sarah got sick, somewhat absent from the most essential parts of his actual existence. Not neglectful, he would resist that word, but distributed too broadly. Present in many places and therefore not fully present anywhere. Sarah had not complained about this. She was not the complaining kind. What she had been was clear-eyed, and in the first months after her diagnosis, when they were still learning the terrain of what they were facing, she had said something to him that he had returned to so many times since that it had become part of the structure of how he thought. She had said, "The things you will regret not doing are very specific, and they are mostly very small, and you already know what they are." He had known exactly what she meant. He had spent the past 3 years living accordingly, and he did not consider this a sacrifice in any meaningful sense of the word. It was simply the correct allocation of the one resource that does not replenish. The meeting was scheduled as a standard pitch session, Elena's team seeking a lead investor for a new artificial intelligence infrastructure project that was, by any reasonable measure, the most ambitious thing Hart Innovations had ever attempted. The technology was sound. The market opportunity was significant. What the company needed was a strategic capital partner with both the resources and the vision to see it through. Several names had been circulated. Several conversations had been initiated. The particular name attached to the final candidate on the list had arrived through a private intermediary, and Elena's team had done their diligence without surfacing much public information, which was, in itself, slightly unusual. She noted the gap, but filed it under the category of private investors who preferred discretion, a category she respected. She walked into the conference room at 9 in the morning with her usual composure, her usual preparation, her usual certainty that she would read the room in the first 30 seconds and calibrate accordingly. The door opened. Brian Evans walked in. He was wearing a well-cut jacket over a simple shirt. The kind of clothing that was unmistakably good without announcing itself the wardrobe of a man with taste, rather than the wardrobe of a man with a stylist. He looked exactly like himself. He was looking at his phone as he entered, finished whatever he was reading, pocketed it, and looked up. His eyes found Elena's with a recognition that was quiet and utterly composed. Around the table, every executive on Elena's team was already standing. Her CFO, a man who had negotiated with sovereign wealth funds without breaking a sweat, looked visibly deferential. Her COO, who was famously unimpressed by most people, had adopted the particular attentive posture she reserved for people whose time she considered more valuable than her own. Elena heard the introduction, as though it were arriving from a significant distance. The co-founder of NovaCore Technologies, the firm that had redefined several sectors of the global technology investment landscape, a man whose strategic contributions to the companies in his portfolio had generated returns that were discussed with something approaching reverence in certain circles, estimated assets in the billions. Notoriously private, rarely photographed, never quoted in the press. The name she had not quite connected, until this moment, to the man in the gray Henley at the community center. Brian Evans. He shook hands with each person at the table, with the same calm efficiency with which he had arranged trays of donated food. And when he reached Elena, he extended his hand and met her gaze with an expression that was professional, cordial, and revealed precisely nothing about what had passed between them. He did not smirk. He did not use the moment to make her small. He shook her hand, said it was good to meet her team, and took his seat, and the meeting proceeded. Elena spent the next hour delivering her pitch with the mechanical precision of someone whose body is performing a task, while their mind is conducting an entirely separate, rather frantic audit. The numbers were right. The projections were coherent. Her team was excellent. But beneath all of it, running like a current she could not interrupt, was the slow and scalding recognition of what she had done. The things she had said. The performance of superiority. The particular cruelty of public dismissal directed at a man who had done nothing except ask if she'd like to get coffee. The face of an 8-year-old girl closing her small hand around her father's. By the time the meeting ended, and Brian had exchanged contact information with Elena's legal team, and departed with a nod and a quiet "we'll be in touch," Elena was left standing at the head of her conference table, feeling like she had swallowed something that hadn't agreed with her. One of her executives said something celebratory. The meeting had gone well. The connection was clearly positive. Elena nodded. She waited until she was alone. Then she sat down in the nearest chair and stared at the far wall for a very long time. The research she conducted over the following days was thorough in the way that only genuine astonishment can motivate. She knew how to dig, and she dug. What she found reshaped the picture she had assembled of Brian Evans with the particular efficiency of a puzzle, whose final pieces reveal that the image is entirely different from what you assumed. He had co-founded NovaCore in his early 30s alongside a college roommate, and the two of them had built it into one of the most influential technology investment platforms of the past decade. A firm known not just for the scale of its returns, but for the quality of its judgment, the patience of its approach, and the unusual ethical framework it applied to the companies it chose to back. Brian had been the visionary architect of that framework. He had been, in the rooms where it mattered, enormously respected. And then, 6 years ago, his wife, a woman named Sarah, a pediatrician who by all accounts had been extraordinary, had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive autoimmune condition. She had lived for 2 years after the diagnosis. And in those 2 years, Brian had quietly, systematically, stepped back from the daily operations of NovaCore. He had been present for every treatment. He had been there the night she died. Lily had been 5 years old. In the years that followed, Brian had restructured his involvement with the firm into a strategic advisory role that consumed perhaps 2 days of his week. The rest of his time, by every account Elena could piece together, went to his daughter and to a network of philanthropic commitments, so quietly sustained that most of the organizations he supported had no idea who their anonymous benefactor actually was. A group of charter schools in 3 cities had been funded through a foundation whose name traced back, through 2 layers of organizational structure, to Brian. A children's hospital wing bore a name that was not his. A youth development fund that had quietly changed the trajectory of hundreds of young people over the past 4 years had been seeded, sustained, and protected from publicity by a man who had given the relevant foundation's board a single instruction: "Don't mention me." Elena read all of this in the small hours of the morning in her apartment, the city glittering silently beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and felt the architecture of her self-certainty develop a crack that ran from the foundation all the way to the roof. She had looked at him and seen a man of no consequence. She had seen ordinary clothing and an unassuming manner and a child at his side and concluded, in the span of a heartbeat, that he was beneath her. And she had been so spectacularly, irrevocably wrong that the wrongness of it had a kind of grandeur. The detail that stayed with her longest was not the valuation, not the scale of what he had built at NovaCore, not even the breadth of the philanthropy. It was something smaller. A former colleague of Brian's, interviewed years earlier in a profile that had focused on NovaCore's founding rather than on Brian himself, had said offhandedly that Brian was the only person he had ever known who was equally comfortable in a boardroom, negotiating 9-figure deals, and in a kindergarten classroom, reading picture books, and who treated both rooms with the same quality of complete attention. The colleague had meant it as a compliment, but had framed it as a curiosity, as if the combination were strange or paradoxical. Elena now understood that it was not paradoxical at all. It was simply what integrity looked like when it was lived rather than performed. The same man who had quietly funded the charter schools was the same man who arranged donated trays of food with focused care and crouched down to hear what his daughter was saying. The consistency was not accidental. It was character, actual, durable, non-negotiable character. And she had looked right at it and decided it wasn't worth her time. She thought of what Gerald had said: "Not everyone who doesn't is beneath it." She had smiled at that. She could not smile at it now. She requested a meeting with Brian through his assistant, framing it as a follow-up to their business discussion. She prepared what she intended to say with the same diligence she brought to a board presentation. She rehearsed it, revised it, cut the parts that sounded self-serving, kept the parts that were simply true. When they met, in a quiet restaurant he had suggested, she delivered her apology without qualification and without the kind of elaborate self-flagellation that is really a second performance. She told him she had been wrong. She told him the specific nature of the wrong, the public setting, the dismissiveness, the assumption she had made with insufficient information, and a surfeit of arrogance. She told him she was sorry. Brian listened to all of it with the same focused attention he seemed to bring to every conversation, his hands around a coffee cup, his eyes steady and neither warm nor cold. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he appreciated what she'd said, and that he understood it had not been easy to say, and that he held no particular grievance. He said it without stiffness and without performance. He was, she realized, genuinely not angry, and somehow his lack of anger was more difficult to sit with than anger would have been. She had expected something she could push against. Instead, he offered her simple, gracious acknowledgement, and a polite and definitive distance. She did not attempt to collapse that distance through force. She had done enough forcing for one lifetime. What she did instead was show up, not dramatically, not with grand gestures, but with the patient, consistent presence of someone who is trying to relearn something fundamental. She reached out to the nonprofit from the community center and asked how she might be useful. She joined a committee working on educational technology access, and she worked on it genuinely, not as a branding exercise but because the work was real and the children it was meant to serve were real. She attended meetings where Brian also appeared, and she was professional and friendly and did not make her presence about him. She watched Lily from a respectful distance, and one afternoon, when Lily raced over to show Elena a drawing she had made of what she described as a galaxy with feelings, Elena sat down on the gymnasium floor in her blazer and her good shoes, and looked at the drawing with the full, serious attention it deserved. "This one," she said, pointing to a swirl of purple in the upper corner, "looks like it's thinking about something complicated." Lily's eyes went wide. "That's exactly what it's doing," she whispered. Lily came around first. She had a child's unerring instinct for sincerity, and whatever calculation had once operated in Elena's approach to the world was being steadily dismantled. And Lily could feel it. She started saving drawings for Elena. She asked, with the directness of the very young, whether Elena liked dogs, whether she had ever been to the ocean, whether she thought it was better to be fast or to be careful. Elena answered honestly every time. Brian watched this with the careful attention of a man who has learned, at great cost, to trust what he observes rather than what he is told. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in October, while Elena was in the middle of a strategy session with her senior leadership team. Her phone lit up with a number she recognized Brian's, which he had shared as part of their ongoing business relationship. She stepped out of the room and answered, and heard in the first syllable of his voice something that made her stomach drop. Lily had collapsed at school. They were en route to the hospital. He had called her because, he said, and then stopped, and then said only that he had called her. She was in her car before the call ended. She called her assistant and said the rest of the meeting would have to proceed without her, and when her assistant asked if everything was all right, Elena said no and hung up. She spent 4 hours in the pediatric wing of a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and industrial coffee, sitting in a waiting area with chairs that were designed to be endured rather than occupied. Brian arrived 40 minutes after she did, gray-faced and moving, with the barely contained urgency of a parent operating at the outer edge of composure. He saw her in the waiting room and stopped, and something moved through his expression that was complicated and unresolved and deeply human. She didn't say anything clever. She stood up and she said, "She's going to be okay. They've told me she's going to be okay." It was not information she had been officially given, but it was what she believed, and she said it with a conviction that seemed to reach him in a way that a more measured statement would not have. He sat down beside her. He put his face in his hands. She sat quietly with him, in the way of someone who has finally learned that being present is often enough, and that the impulse to fill silence is often about your own discomfort rather than the other person's need. Lily had experienced a severe respiratory episode related to an undetected asthma condition, exacerbated by a viral infection. She was uncomfortable, but stable. She was going to be fine. When Brian was allowed into her room, and Elena asked a nurse whether she should wait or leave, the nurse, misreading the relationship in the way that nurses in pediatric wards sometimes do when they see people who clearly care about the same child, suggested she go on in. Elena went in. Lily, propped against pillows with a small oxygen monitor clipped to her finger, looked at Elena with the large, exhausted eyes of a child who has just been through something frightening, and held out one hand. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and took it, and did not let go for a very long time. Brian sat on the other side. Outside the window, the October light was going pale and orange over the city. In the particular quiet of that hospital room, the three of them existed briefly in something that had no name yet, but was unmistakably real. Later, much later, after Lily had fallen asleep and the room had grown dark, except for the soft lights of the monitoring equipment, Brian and Elena sat in the corridor with paper cups of terrible coffee, and he talked. He talked about Sarah, about the way she had approached her illness with a kind of fierce and practical grace that he was still, years later, trying to understand and absorb. He talked about the specific terror of watching someone you love diminish and being unable to reverse it by effort or intelligence or will. He talked about Lily, how Lily had her mother's laugh, her mother's particular way of tilting her head when she was thinking, her mother's absolutely uncompromising approach to the question of whether a thing was fair. He talked about the decision to step back from the full-throttle version of his professional life, and how it had not felt like sacrifice, exactly, more like clarification, more like understanding, finally, which things were load-bearing and which things were decoration. Elena listened. She did not offer her own story in exchange, not yet. She just listened, and the listening was the most genuinely useful thing she had done in a very long time. When she finally spoke, she said only that she was glad he had called her. He looked at her for a moment. He said he was glad too. The hallway was very quiet. Neither of them moved to leave. Lily came home 4 days later, slightly indignant about having missed a school project deadline, and entirely indignant about the dietary restrictions her doctor had recommended for the following 2 weeks. She made her opinions on both matters very clear, which Brian said, privately and to Elena, was the surest possible sign that she was fully herself again. The routine of their life reconstituted itself: school, dinner, homework, weekend activities, and Elena found herself a more regular presence in the texture of it. She came for dinner on a Tuesday and helped Lily with a biography project about a woman scientist Lily had chosen with the specific intention of making her teacher nervous. She came on a Saturday to a community cleanup event and spent 3 hours pulling weeds from a neglected neighborhood garden in clothes that would need to be replaced. She was not performing transformation, she was inhabiting it, which is a slower and less photogenic process, and which was, she was learning, the only version that means anything. Brian's walls came down the way. Walls tend to come down when they are not forced, but simply weighted out gradually, unevenly, with occasional reversals, until one day you notice they are gone. He told her one evening, as they cleaned up after dinner while Lily did her reading in the next room, that he had spent a long time after their initial meeting assuming she was a fixed type, a category of person he had encountered before and understood, one whose priorities were arranged in a particular order that left no room for him or anything he valued. He said he had been glad to discover he was wrong. He said it simply, without making it into a larger statement than it was. Elena said that she had been wrong first and worse. He said that might be true. And then he smiled, and it was the smile she remembered from the community center, unhurried, unperformed, genuine in the way of a man who does not smile to manage impressions, and she felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Their first kiss was not a dramatic event. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon on the back steps of his house, with Lily visible through the kitchen window practicing something on a recorder she had recently decided to learn, filling the air with enthusiastic and aggressively approximate music. Brian had said something dry and affectionate about the recorder. Elena had laughed in a way that felt physical, full, unguarded, belonging to a version of herself that was younger than the CEO and older than the frightened girl from the apartment with the unreliable heat. He looked at her when she laughed, and the looking was its own kind of statement. And then, without much ceremony, he leaned forward and kissed her. And it was quiet and unhurried, and tasted of afternoon coffee, and when it ended they sat there for a moment in the recorder music with the easy, unspoken understanding of two people who have found each other by the long route. The year that followed was not the year Elena had expected to live. It was better, and stranger, and more demanding, and more nourishing than anything she had planned. Hard innovations grew significantly, in fact, in part because the strategic investment partnership with Novacore provided not just capital, but a quality of insight that sharpened the company's trajectory in ways Elena's team was still mapping. But the growth mattered to her differently now. She had not abandoned ambition she suspected she never would, that it was too deeply woven into her to be removed without taking essential tissue with it. But she had relocated it within a larger sense of what a life was supposed to do. She had always measured success in acquisitions, in valuations, in the clean upward arcs of graphs. She was learning to measure it also in dinners that went long, in the particular satisfaction of a child's genuine laughter, in the feeling of being known by someone who had no reason to be impressed by you and chose to love you anyway. Brian managed the balance with the practiced ease of a man who had made his choices clearly and was not ambivalent about them. His work at Novacore was meaningful and well-defined, and he gave it what it required without giving it what belonged elsewhere. He mentored. He invested in companies he believed were genuinely trying to do good things. He attended every school event, every performance, every occasion that Lily considered important, regardless of its objective significance. He volunteered, still, on Tuesday afternoons. He cooked dinner most nights. He read. He was, in all the ways that mattered, a full person, a person who had done the hard work of figuring out what he was for and then organized his life around that answer. Elena found this not just attractive but instructive. It was a mode of existing in the world she was only beginning to understand how to inhabit. Lily had, by the middle of that year, stopped treating Elena's presence as something to be remarked upon and begun treating it as something to be counted on, which was, they both agreed privately, the most meaningful milestone available. She showed Elena her drawings without preamble and expected substantive responses. She involved Elena in debates about fictional characters with the same intensity she brought to every other subject. She called Elena by her name, which she pronounced with a particular inflection that conveyed both affection and a barely concealed sense of her own authority in the relationship. She was, Brian said once, evaluating Elena according to criteria he had not been fully briefed on. Elena said she thought she might be passing. He said the recorder music had probably helped. Elena said she would take it. The fundraising gala was held in November, in a venue that had the good taste to be impressive without being ostentatious. High ceilings, warm lighting, round tables covered in white linen, the kind of event that asks something of the people who attend it and rewards the asking. It was organized by the foundation that had, over the previous year, become meaningful to Elena in a way that most professional obligations were not. She had been asked to speak, and she had agreed without the usual negotiation about length and positioning and strategic optics. She had something she actually wanted to say. She stood at the podium in front of several hundred people, colleagues, philanthropists, community members, city officials, a few faces from the press, and she spoke without notes. She told them that for most of her professional life, she had operated according to a particular understanding of value that had accrued to those who achieved, who accumulated, who could demonstrate their worth through the ledger of accomplishment. She told them that this understanding had shaped her in ways she was still auditing, some good, many less so. She told them that she had met a man at an event, much like this one, smaller, plainer, with casseroles instead of catered appetizers, and that she had looked at him and seen someone she believed was not worth her time, and that she had said as much, and that she had been wrong in a way that she was grateful for, because the wrongness had done what comfortable certainties never can. It had required her to change. She did not name him. She did not need to. She said only that the truest education she had ever received had come not from a business school or a board meeting, but from watching a man live, watching the specific, concrete way he cared for his daughter, sustained his community, honored the memory of the person he had lost, and moved through a world that offered him every reason for bitterness, with a generosity she still found humbling. She said that she now understood that character is a form of achievement, the rarest and most demanding kind, and that it cannot be worn or displayed or put on a slide deck, and that this is precisely what makes it worth more than anything else. The room was quiet in the way rooms get, when something true has been said clearly. She thanked the foundation and left the podium. And when she returned to her table, Brian was looking at her with an expression that required no translation. He proposed 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, the particular kind of Sunday afternoon that feels deliberately designed for the important things. Lily was there, because Lily was always there, and because Brian had asked her first, on a Tuesday evening over the recorder practice, whether she thought it was a good idea. Lily had considered the question with the seriousness it deserved and then said, "Yes, but she has to promise to take the planet earrings to the wedding." Brian said he would pass along the requirement. He did. Elena, hearing the condition delivered over a kitchen table while Lily watched from the doorway with barely contained ceremonial satisfaction, said that she would put them in writing, if necessary. He brought out a ring that was simple and beautiful, and when he put it on her finger, and she said yes, not performing, not calculating, simply saying yes, Lily erupted from the doorway and inserted herself between them with the forceful tenderness of a child who has decided that this family is her project and she is the manager of it. The wedding was in April, in a garden that caught the late afternoon light at exactly the right angle, as if even the day understood the assignment. It was small, not a performance, not a statement, not an occasion for press coverage or strategic presence. It was people who actually loved them, gathered to witness something that had taken the long way around to arrive but had arrived. Elena wore the earrings. Lily was in a dress she had selected independently and with great conviction, a yellow dress with small embroidered stars, and she stood up very straight throughout the ceremony with the gravity of someone discharging a sacred duty. When the officiant reached the part of the service about building a life together from this day forward, Lily nodded as though she had written the clause herself. What they built, in the months and years that followed, was not the life Elena had drawn up in the early years of her ambition, the clean, legible, impressive life she had imagined as the antidote to everything she had grown up without. It was something less symmetrical and more alive. It had difficult mornings and extraordinary dinners. It had arguments about small things and absolute agreement about large ones. It had school events and board meetings and community gardens and late nights working through problems together at the kitchen table while the city quieted outside. It had a child who grew steadily into herself, curious, principled, funny, in a way that caught you off guard, and 2 adults who were doing the patient, unglamorous, essential work of becoming the people they wanted to be, for her and for each other and for themselves. Heart Innovations continued to grow, but Elena ran it differently now, not from fear, and not from the restless, compulsive need to prove something that had driven her through her 20s and early 30s, but from genuine commitment to what the company was actually doing and who it was doing it for. She brought a new framework to her hiring practices, one that Gerald noted with quiet, vindicated approval, in which character was evaluated as rigorously as credentials. She championed a mentorship program for first-generation professionals that drew on her own history in ways she had previously been reluctant to acknowledge publicly. She spoke at conferences differently, less about the mechanics of building an empire, more about the harder and less discussed question of what the empire is supposed to be for. The women who sought her out as a model found a version of Elena Hart they hadn't seen in the magazine profiles, and they told her so, and she was glad. Brian's work at NovaCore entered a period of particular focus during those years, centered on a portfolio of companies working at the intersection of healthcare technology and access, a direction that was not coincidental, rooted, as it was, in the years he had spent navigating a medical system on behalf of someone he loved, and in the years since spent watching what happened to families who faced the same navigation without his resources. He was patient and demanding in equal measure with the companies he backed, asking the questions that were hardest to answer honestly, and refusing to accept the ones that dressed up market strategy as mission. The people who worked with him said that the combination of his insight and his moral seriousness made for a particular kind of discipline that was rare in the industry. Lily, when she was old enough to understand something of what her father did, asked him once whether he liked his work. He said that he liked it when it was honest. She accepted this as the complete and sufficient answer it was. Elena sometimes thought about the woman she had been standing in that community center, certain, efficient, so completely sure she could read the room and everything in it. She did not hate that woman. That woman had survived something difficult and built something real and was doing her inadequate best with the tools she had assembled. But she was glad, with a gladness that was quiet and physical, and located somewhere beneath language, that she had been wrong, that the world had given her the specific, unlikely gift of being corrected, not gently, and not without cost, and not in a way she would have chosen, but in the only way that actually reaches people who have spent a long time being very good at being right. She had needed to fail her own test. She had needed to look at a man of extraordinary substance and see only his surface, and then be forced, slowly and thoroughly, to reckon with the difference. There are people who live their entire lives inside their original assumptions, and the world around them arranges itself to avoid disturbing those assumptions. And they die, having never had the particular, wrenching, clarifying experience of discovering that the thing they were most certain about was the thing they most needed to question. She had been given that experience. She had not wasted it. Brian said once, on an ordinary evening, that he thought the best things that had ever happened to him had also been the hardest. She knew what he meant. She knew he was not only talking about her. She knew he was also talking about loss and grief and the long education of the years he had spent putting a life back together for himself and Lily, those years of quiet and purposeful living that she had once looked at and seen only plainness. She understood now what she had been looking at. She understood now what plain, undisplayed purpose actually looks like when you are close enough to see it clearly. It looks like someone who knows what they love and chooses it every day without needing anyone else to witness the choice. It looks like a man in a gray Henley arranging trays of food for children who need it, with a small girl at his side who has the whole of his heart. In a community center decorated with crooked artwork, on an ordinary Saturday morning that contains, if you know how to look, everything that matters. The world is full of people waiting to be correctly seen. The cost of seeing them, the real cost, the one that asks something of you, is only the willingness to look past what you expect to find. Long enough to encounter what is actually there. Elena Hart had paid that cost. She would not have traded the paying of it for anything.